Uh-oh.
Mm.
This is good. It's got a part. Yeah. The other one's too sweet.
Yes.
Okay, I hope you're all seeing the snowpack data. Uh-oh, looks like the years are cut off. Are you seeing this slide?
Yeah.
Okay. The headline is 1982. I'm sorry the dates are cut off. Was actually a little bit worse, but as David has pointed out, it's an imprecise measurement, and we'll have a better idea once it's melted and other measurements are in. But anyway, you can see that over the decades, there have been 3 other episodes, at least approaching this. Who knows exactly? So it just makes us humble. David sent this nice link. If anybody wants to dive deeper, he pointed out that it's a rabbit hole, and it was for me. But there's some interesting stuff you could find. This was just one of the many images, if you're interested. So thanks, David. And here's another image from this. In black is North America. So this is the United States. Here's Baja. And this was an interesting image of the atmospheric river. That really is impressive. So I enjoyed the site. Thanks again, David.
I kind of figured that,
Cabrillo is going to encounter Cortes in Veracruz, but the question is, how did Cortes get to Veracruz with an Aztec interpreter? David shared this simple version of the conquest of the New World. I cued in just to show you the dates here of Cortes in particular, 1519. But we left off last time saying, no, there was something that happened before. And this was an earlier shipwreck in 1511. And I went through that with you. I'm going to zip through these slides. You saw all this last week. There were 2 survivors, a soldier. The soldier marries, has the first mestizo, and he becomes a character in Mayan folklore and comic books. And so this is just reviewing a couple of things. The other thing I wanted to throw in before we get back to 1719 is this in the news today for our section on the Silk Road. The Caspian Sea is involved in the current war in Ukraine, and apparently Iran is shipping munitions across the Caspian, and the United States is investigating how to interrupt that. And I think David's reaction is appropriate. There have been smaller things that have led to world wars, let's put it that way. And this is the satellite maps showing the progress of these ships carrying the munitions. They can follow it very precisely. Okay, so how did,
John,
yeah.
so what is Iran's interest in supporting Russia They both are exporters of oil. Is it just that Russia, my enemy's enemy is my friend? Is that why Iran is supporting Russia? Because it's so.
I think, yes, I think since the United States is the devil, really, in both cases, really, you look at Russian propaganda and they think the United States is part of a satanic cult that have been taken over by homosexuals, right? And that's strangely in line with the rigid religious thought of the Shias in Iran. Very weird, but weirder things have happened. That's my first take on it. Anybody else? But yeah, interesting question. Well, we'll keep our eye on that.
John, I have a question. How about where does this play in with Russia's affiliation with Syria? Because they were supporting the the Assad, whatever his name is, regime in Syria.
Well, so is Iran, right? The Assad is a kind of strange kind of Shia. And his regime has been ruling Syria. It's kind of an odd inverse of what happened in Iraq. In Iraq, you have a majority Shia, and the British left the Sunni in charge. That's what the British do, is they find a disgruntled minority. And so they left the Sunnis in charge of all the Shias, and that Sunni regime evolved to Saddam. The opposite happened in Syria. The French left the power to the Shia, and a large section of Syria was Sunni. So it's weird. And Iran has been supporting Syria, Hezbollah specifically. And they are the surrogate in Lebanon, right next door. And Iran's got their hand in there against their avowed enemy, Israel. So, Israel plays into this with respect to Syria and Iraq, and now you have Saudi Arabia kind of coming into the picture, and there China has stepped in to patch up their relationship with Iran. So, studying the Silk Road in the background of all these countries is helpful, but it's very complicated. May not be enough. Anybody got any more to add? That's my hot take.
Well, John, isn't it also an economic difference in terms of, they see us as the capitalists exploiting the world, and we've certainly meddled in a lot of countries in South America and Afghanistan. I mean, I think they see us as meddling in their own backyard.
Sure, absolutely. We came out of World War II with a lot of political capital. But in my lifetime, I think the two major frittering of that capital was Vietnam and Iraq. I think both of those, and what's now called the Global South. When I was in the 50s and 60s, that was called the Third World. I made the mistake of saying that in front of our young residents at the hospital and was reprimanded. We don't say that anymore, Dr. Lee. So
Probably Iran-Contra didn't help either.
Right.
yeah, and so the global South, let's all get that in our minds. And they, another resentment they have was the way the COVID immunization was distributed. That sure, who wouldn't take care of their own population first, but it had a kind of an awkward feel to it, and the global South thinks they had to wait too long to get COVID immunization. But I think it's been mainly Vietnam. That was huge. And then Iraq, where we explicitly defied the United Nations. So now Putin, and that made Putin mad. I read his biographies, and he thought the United States was hypocritical for proclaiming international law, yet ignoring the United Nations, and we were. And that upset me too. But it also upset the rest of the world, and it turns out now, flash forward 20 years from 2003, and they're holding a grudge. So that's my hot take on that comment. Anybody else? Okay, are we ready to fly back to 1519, having solved the problems of 2023? Okay, 1519. Now, Cortes did not go to Veracruz, as shown on the previous map. He first went to Cozumel from Santiago, which was then the Spanish headquarters in the southeast coast of Cuba. And he went rogue. The governor had said, no, we're calling off your trip. But he'd already arranged the ships and the men, and in the middle of the night, they all left. And he headed to Cozumel as an outlaw. He was an outlaw. Instead of being a conquistador, he was a caudillo or a warlord. He was totally rogue. Now, you remember the story that I told last week about the shipwreck in 1511, and his buddy, the soldier, stayed, but they're both in Cozumel when Cortes lands, and Cortes meets them. The priest Aguilar goes along with him. Cortes is definitely on his way to Veracruz, but they go around the Yucatan, making many stops. And at one of the stops at a Mayan village, the Mayan chieftain, impressed by Cortes's entourage, offers him some young women. And one of the young women is not Mayan. One of the young women is a captured Aztec woman who plays a huge part in Mexican history. The key thing is she can speak Aztec. She has learned Mayan. Aguilar, the priest, has learned Mayan, so they can talk to each other. And so this is the kind of like a game of telephone. Cortes encounters Aztecs, or at least people who speak Aztec, and he can communicate with them and come up with a game plan once he gets to Veracruz. He speaks in Spanish to Aguilar, Aguilar speaks in Mayan, which he knows, and I'm blocking her name. Not Pocahontas. Yeah, and then she speaks Aztec to the others. It'll come to me. So he lands at Veracruz with 500 men. That's pretty amazing. The number of outlaws he's been able to recruit, and 12 horses. So back to Cabrillo. This is our topic. And you'll remember Cabrillo, a orphan, probably born in Portugal, eventually joins the Spanish Navy and gets to Cuba. And when the governor declares Cortes an outlaw, he puts together a sheriff's posse to pursue Cortes, led by this guy. Narvaez goes to Veracruz with his posse, but Cortes attacks him and his 900 soldiers at night, surprise attack. Cortes has got 500, and Narvaez is killed in the attack, but Cortes is a very charismatic guy, and he talks to the surviving soldiers of Narvaez, tells them about Aztec gold that he's learned in gathering intelligence, and Cabrillo switches sides. And then Cortes does an amazing thing. Now he has his own men, 500, and then there was 900 men. Not all of them survived. So he's got it over 1,000 men, but some of them want to go home. They don't want to be involved in that. They didn't sign up to attack Montezuma. So what does he do? He burns his boats so nobody can leave. And okay, now everybody is on board. How crazy was that? And so they are ready with their men and a lot of Aztec Native American enemies. It's not just Europeans. The Aztecs are pretty ruthless dudes, right? Ripping out hearts and all sacrifices. And so they got a lot of enemies. But Cabrillo has some knowledge about sailing. That's kind of his specialty, and he's put in charge of preparing the vessels. This is the guy who's going to be the first Spaniard explorer to step foot in California. And I'm giving you his background because it's, first of all, it's important. Second of all, it's fascinating. So how does he prepare ships? He needs caulk. So, and how there's no tar around. So what does he do? He mixes up pine resin and human fat rendered from the bodies of dead Aztecs. Come on. So here are the new boats. Here are the new boats. Yes, because those big boats were useless on the Lake Tenochtitlan. They needed little boats to assault that island that I think just had one causeway. Maybe there was another one. I can't remember.
I think there were 3, John.
Were there? Okay, thank you. And so they build these little boats, Rudy, and caulked with pine resin and human rendered human fat, and they are from a higher position and gunpowder. They're able to defeat these Aztec canoes. Crazy. Now, so Cortes is a bad dude, but there's other bad dudes. And Cabrillo's nearest commander is this guy Alvarado, and he's going to be an important player in the development of Cabrillo's attitude and power. And Cabrillo is going to become one of the richest conquistador, and a lot of it has to do with partnering Alvarado. Because Alvarado said, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm going to Guatemala. And he gets Cortes to appoint him the governor of Guatemala. And Cabrillo's smart enough to hitch his wagon to Cabrillo I'm sorry, to Alvarado. And by now, Cabrillo has a horse, which was the highest award that you can get for valor in the Battle of Tenochtitlan. Now, Cortes wanted Cabrillo to stay. He thought he might need someone of his ability, and he offered him a feudal estate. In Spanish, that's encomienda. But just think of that as a feudal estate, part of feudalism. But Cabrillo says, no, I'm off with Alvarado, making a decision for adventure over and over again. And he gets an estate and a feudal estate in Guatemala and becomes one of the richest of the conquistadors, as I said, forgetting his humble roots. And he was ruthless. He became a warlord. He armed warriors that went up and rounded up workers, really enslaved them, broke into homes, took women, and put these slaves to work mining gold. For those of us that have been to Oaxaca, it was Cabrillo, before he came to California, who subdued the Mixtec people in Oaxaca. So pretty ruthless, these Spanish. And so I've asked Homer a question that he has willingly accepted to answer. And my question is were the French any more enlightened with Native Americans than the Spanish or the British? Take it, Homer.
Well, okay. Gotta admit to my biases here, because my ancestors came to French Canada in 1632, and there was a difference right away. Pierre Boushey, who had 7 sons, I don't know how many daughters he had in the 17th century. His first wife died, and his second wife was Iroquois. The French were much more likely to marry native people than were the English or Spanish, married in the conventional sense of forming a lasting union until one or the other of them died. And just a little quick research confirms some of my biases. But if you were to characterize this Spanish approach to colonization in a few words, you might say it was conquest, control, conversion, and enslavement. That would be the 4 words that they used. Their interest was in extracting wealth from their colonies. The French had a different approach. They were interested in trade, and they established multiple small trading stations. Think of the fur traders in Canada, rather than subjugating large numbers of people to extract wealth directly, they traded for it, probably on terms very favorable to themselves, but nonetheless, their approach was to establish trading. Sort of ironically, the influence of Spain on its colonies was longer lasting. They did draw more wealth from their colonies. They had a greater cultural impact, maybe not one that we would think is wholesome, but that impact lasted a lot longer after the end of their colonization than the French. Now, the French were slightly disadvantaged by losing control of their major colony, Canada, to the English after the 7 Years' War. So you really can't tell much about the long-term consequences. I will say, my last comments here, there's a book it's been a long time since I've read it. I think it's called The Six Nations of North America. And he traces the differences in these six nations. There's the English in the Chesapeake area, in South Carolina, different from Georgia, different from French Canada, different from Southwestern US, different from the Pacific Northwest. But the region he likes most is the combination of French Canada and the territories to the north as having the most easy relationships among people of different backgrounds. So that might be a offshoot from a more gentle approach to colonization. Another sort of odd irony is that Spain and France are, of course, absolute monarchies in this colonial period, where the English were not. So the English are more likely to set up, of course, you didn't ask me to compare them to the English. They were to more likely set up local chiefs, sort of enlist them in the British administrative system. They'd be local people incorporated into their hierarchical bureaucracy. So that's what I'd have to say, because I don't want to take more of your time.
Oh, well, that was excellent, Homer. Just on your last point, the Iroquois had a highly developed government system, as did the Cherokee, actually. And I think Washington expressed admiration for the Iroquois and worked with them in the way that you just described. The other comment I would make is the book you talked about, American Nations. It was by Colin Woodward. And I think you and I have talked about.
Yeah, we've talked about it. The Six Nations of North America is the title, I remember, but I haven't looked at it in ages.
Yeah, well, it's 9 nations.
Oh, okay.
And the northernmost is the French, as you point out, but the southernmost is El Norte, and that includes what we've been talking about.
Right.
Before we got to California, when we were talking about Coronado and New Mexico.
That's right.
Santa Fe. That's El Norte, and that's in this. Colin Woodward describes that in the same spirit that he describes the other nations that you described. Excellent. I loved it. Thank you, Homer.
You're welcome.
Question.
Hey, John, I thought the Iroquois nation was used as such a model that the whole American government of the House, the division of power, was actually modeled after that.
Could be. I don't know. It's something.
I think there's a book about that, how they had the House and the Senate and the leader, and I believe the whole power structure there is what the American Revolution's model was based on. But yeah.
Yeah, I think though the separation of powers came from Europe. Aiko has a question.
I'll come over here because we can't turn on our audio. Homer, is there something to do with also the church involvement? Because, the Spanish church was just very involved, very strict. What was the French church like?
That's a good question, Aiko. I don't know fully the answer. I mean, again, my ancestor, Pierre Boushey, went to France to report to His Most Catholic Majesty, Louis XIV, on the state of Canada and the head of the church, of course, in France. Well, it was the Pope, of course, France being a Catholic country. So I'm afraid I don't know how to answer the question. I would think not nearly as involved as the Spanish church was.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well,
Sure.
good. We have some things to do a little research on for next week. I'll put up a map of Colin Woodward's American nations next week.
That'd be
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And when it comes down to analyzing election results and political trends, it's fun. Okay. So back to Cabrillo. He took local Mayan wives, had children, but the point was his kids couldn't inherit all the wealth that he'd accumulated, because to do so in Spanish law, you had to be white Spanish. And so he went back to Spain, called a timeout, went back, got a Spanish wife, and he did very well because his new father-in-law was a shipping magnate, right up his alley, shipping. And then he took on the title of a squire. I don't know what the Spanish is for squire. And a merchant. So all of a sudden, regardless of whether he was Portuguese or what his social status was, with this marriage, he became a squire, and he was declared a citizen of the Spanish world, specifically a citizen of Santiago in Guatemala. And when his father-in-law died, he inherited a fleet of ships. So those ships are going to be instrumental in the exploration of the California coast. He went back with his wife, and in addition to everything else that he was doing, became a gentleman farmer, if you will, making these, growing these bountiful crops that gave him a lot of profit. But he's still building ships. And one of his best ships was called San Salvador. That'll pop up a little bit later on. And so he was rich enough to finally respond to the three allures of northern exploration. We've talked about them previously. Number one was to find a resupply place along the coast for any ships that were coming back from Manila. And we talked a little bit about the trade, Spanish silver for Chinese luxury goods. So that was one thing. Where can these ships resupply? After they went across the Pacific, they were low on fresh water, and certainly low on fresh citrus. So scurvy was the limiting factor on these trips. But there were two more theoretical that we've talked about. That was the crazy novel about Queen Calafia, and then and all we've gone into that in detail. I won't do it again, but it's quite fantastical. And this is a mural from Mark Hopkins, I think I've mentioned before. And then the third was the Northwest Passage, the fabled Northwest Passage, and we talked about that in detail. So I won't do that again, except to show this one map. Bob Oxenborough question is, how's come maps continued to show Baja as a island instead of the peninsula that it is? And a lot of it was wishful thinking, as I said. There were some other factors too, like Greek thought about Earth symmetry and things like that. So I'll just throw in a fourth motive, and I think you've already seen it with Cabrillo, and he was just one ambitious guy and maybe greedy, and he certainly had enough wealth. Why didn't he just settle back and enjoy his life as a gentleman farmer? But that's not in the nature of this class of people. Remember, Spain had been fighting off the Muslims for centuries, and the Spanish that survived that were seasoned and adventurers, and there was a strong strain of Viking blood in these Spanish Crusaders that finally fought off the Muslims. And I think that was, if you watch the movie that Ramsey recommended, that came through very, very clear. So he had 4 reasons really to go after the northern mystery, and that boat, the San Salvador, it's going to be his lead boat, and he had financed it all. It took 4 years of his planning, and it was all good because a lot of his wealth was destroyed in an earthquake in Guatemala. Unleashed a river of mud. Some of us had experience with a river of mud on New Year's Eve. And now he was in financial trouble. So rolling the dice and expanding, it got him out of a tight jam. So you remember his buddy Alvarado? Alvarado was going to be a partner in this northern adventure. And when they took off, Alvarado led the way, but was killed by hostile Native Americans and made it into a Mayan codex. And this is an overview of where he's going. And I'll show you another map a little bit later on that's a little more detailed, but just the overview. He leaves from Barria de Novedad, hits Cabo San Lucas, which we all are familiar with now, scoots up the coast to all these places, which previous explorers had done, but none of them got into California itself. But he did, and his orders. The viceroy was still very active, and the viceroy had replaced Cortes, and Cabrillo answered to Spanish administration. So his orders were clear: to search out civilized people, and preferably ones with treasure, and to gather intelligence, namely the Northwest Passage, and avoid violence if possible. So the new viceroys were a little bit more subdued in their approach to force. And the first Native Americans that were encountered by Spanish explorers, Cabrillo, were the Kumeyaay that lived in what's current day San Diego. And there were some other tribes mixed in with them. We won't get into those details, but there are two tribes. So I'm only going to mention three tribes as I talk about Cabrillo and his trip up the coast. The Kumeyaay, the Chumash, which we've talked about in detail, the Channel Island Native Americans, and the Miwoks that we've talked about in exquisite detail. And the Costanoans and the Coast Miwoks and the Lake Miwoks, I'm going to consider them all the same. We're not going to be making the differences for our purposes. But look at the Chumash is the big one. The Chumash is the big one. And so he comes north and discovers this beautiful natural bay, exactly what the Spanish are looking for. A place that you could land, take on fresh water, protected harbor. Look how perfect this is as a bay. And here is Point Loma, which many of us have visited. And the Kumeyaay, they've been here 12,000 years, 12,000 years. And Cabrillo lands, here's a reenactment, but it wasn't like that. It was probably more like this. And when they came ashore, there were some Kumeyaay kids playing around, and of course, the kids are going to be the ones that are going to spot strangers coming in. They tried to run away, but Cabrillo's men grabbed them and gave them small gifts, and they went home with their gifts, and that broke the ice. So pretty soon the Kumeyaay leaders paddled out to the Cabrillo's boat. He gave them a Venetian glass, beads, anything sparkly. We know that from our own history about how the English purchased Manhattan, or was it the Dutch? Yeah, Dutch purchased Manhattan for the equivalent of $26 of beads. And so the downside was the Native Americans showed great fear, and they communicated with sign language that there have been men like Cabrillo, bearded with bows and swords, who had been wreaking havoc inland. And they described and acted out riding a horse. Of course, Cabrillo knew that must have been Coronado's expedition, which was very bloody. He went up to take revenge for the murder of members of a previous expedition. But Cabrillo noted that this is not good. The Kumeyays are on guard, and it's going to make my mission to gather intelligence more difficult. So here's another map of where of Cabrillo's path, and it shows in parallel Coronado, which is just a couple of years before. And you'll remember there were two parts to Coronado. There was a resupply ship that was going up at the mouth of the Colorado River, and they never connected. Coronado never got over there to pick up more supplies, and apparently was able to trudge on. And you'll remember that the folks that went up here went up the Colorado River a little bit, and if they stepped out, and which they probably did on the west shore, they were the first to be in California, in Yuma, but that's not documented. So Cabrillo's the first documented. You see, he's gonna, just a quick overview, he's gonna go up through Los Angeles County, Orange County, the Channel Islands, Point Concepcion. He's going to go all the way up to Point Reyes, and he's going to come back, and he is going to have a very sad ending. I've already tipped my hand. I call this the tragedy of Cabrillo, but he, as on his deathbed, he tells his shipmates, "Look, don't turn back just because I'm going. You guys go on up, further up," and they do. They apparently get all the way to the Oregon border before turning around and coming back. So that's the overview. So the next day, back in San Diego, the Spanish are feeling pretty good about things, so they get out and start fishing. But the Kumeyays are outraged. This is breaking all permitted boundaries. You have to ask permission before you fish in somebody's favorite fishing hole. For them, it was the equivalent of theft, and they rushed to the attack and shot arrows at the Spaniards. So this very first encounter turned sour really quick. Nobody dies, but 3 are wounded. And Cabrillo was mad. In previous years, there might have been hell to pay. But with his orders from the viceroy, with a new philosophy, he did not retaliate. He did not. And so San Diego remembers Cabrillo, but at least the Portuguese have decided he's Portuguese, and they paid for a memorial to be put up at Point Loba, which Point Loma, which you can see today. Here it is, a couple of views of it. And they bought it over for the 1939 World's Fair right here in San Francisco on Treasure Island, which is of personal interest to Aiko and I, because both of our mothers were at that World's Fair. Aiko's mother was living in San Francisco, and my mother was taking one last fling before she got married. She had finished college, and she and a classmate came out of the family was, her father was doing very well, my grandfather, and she went off on a trip to San Francisco in 1939. So this is a glorification of the landing in San Diego. Obviously, you can find these things. Here's another one with that foreshadows the importance of the clergy. Now, this is not a Franciscan, this is a Jesuit, and I'll tell the story of the Jesuits pretty soon. And that's an interesting yarn, and how the Franciscans take over from the Jesuits is totally fascinating. By the way, the current Pope is Franciscan, right? Okay, I have been instructed by my timekeeper that this is the time that we can talk. This will be a good place to resume next time. Comments, questions?
Well, could you tell us again, I missed last week, the name of the movie Ramsey recommends?
Oh, it was a YouTube. So I'll run that down, Homer, and send that out with the link to the video.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Is this about this?
The nicer guy, he didn't seem very.
Well, by the time he gets to San Diego, he's under new marching orders. And so he's not the guy that he was when he went into Guatemala. He's older. He's already richer. He doesn't need any more money, although somebody's got to pay for the earthquake damage. But in San Diego, he does not take revenge. I'm not going to say that how should we think of Cabrillo? There's many different ways to think of Cabrillo, but I think you have to include everything, and including this phase. Now, is his mild approach going to continue? No, it's not, and that's why he dies. So we'll get to that next week. Spoiler alert.
The other thing is, you think about him marrying that rich shipping magnate's daughter. I'm sure she was very young. And then she gets left in Guatemala with an earthquake. And he's running around in San Diego. What a life.
Well, it's good to have the feminine perspective on this. Thank you, Aiko. All right. Okay, other comments?
Well, thank you, John. That's good.
Okay, and I'll send out some information and topics discussed with the link.
Sounds good. Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
You
Thank you,
bet.
John.
Likewise, John, as always.
Thank you.